I was looking through a few videos I made this year, last year I think, or maybe even farther back than that. I came across the video where I did a SlowRate recording. Should be linked to it up there, or I think there. I think it should be there. No, maybe there. Anyway, while it was a decent test of the method, I realized that I didn't actually explain how I set the camera up and what I did in DaVinci Resolve to make it work. So yeah, this is it. This will be the tutorial for SlowRate recording. Just a couple of years too late for anyone was, just in case anyone was interested in how it was made. I mean, yeah. So let's just do some examples. Like right now I'm in regular 24 frames per second. So everything should look like normal. The shutter is at 180 degrees, which makes it, let's see, 1/48 seconds. So let's cut the frame rate in half. So, okay. This is me recording at 12 frames per second. That's for those interested in animation, that is called animating on twos. You hold every drawing 2 frames to half the workload. And speaking of animating on twos, let's go to animating on thirds. Like now. Yeah. So when I went to 12 frames per second, I should have mentioned that sticking with a 180-degree shutter, the exposure time actually went from 1/48 to 1/24 for 12 frames per second. So I became a little bit brighter in exposure, not in intellect. And now at 8 frames per second, the exposure should go up even more, because now I'm at, what is it, like 1/16 frames per second. So I don't know what that calculates to in like actual f-stops, but yeah. And now, as we're at 8 frames per second now, let's go all the way down to the bottom that the camera can actually record correctly with no fuss, which is 5 frames per second. Yeah. Now we are at 5 frames per second. The motion blur should be pretty severe right now. So yeah. But in my example video, I actually set the lowest frame rate to 2.5 frames per second. And you might be wondering how, if 5 frames per second is the lowest that the camera can do, how I actually got it to half that. Oh, and by the way, 5 frames per second, that's 1/10 seconds exposure time. So I should be starting to blow out, like here and here, I think. Yeah. Let's move over to 2.5 frames per second just to show that it's possible. Now explain how I did it. So this is 2.5 frames per second. It should be really full of motion blur. But if I do this correctly, it should be able to sync up correctly with just a little bit of, maybe. The trick to getting 2.5 frames per second from this camera is to actually run it at 5 frames per second in 360-degree shutter. That equates to a shutter speed of 1/5 seconds, which incidentally is the same shutter speed that a 2.5 frames per second recording has if you just skip every other frame of the 5 frames per second. So all I need to do to get this camera to record at 2.5 frames per second is therefore to set it to 5 frames per second and tell it to skip every other frame, and the frames that are recording should be at 360-degree shutter. That way I get the correct motion blur and the correct frame rate. Yeah. Let's see how to do that on the camera. The one that you're looking at right now is a Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 6K second generation. On the side of the screen there's a button called HFR, and really it should be OFR, because it's not just high frame rates it can also record lower frame rates, such as what I just did with 12 frames and 8 frames and all that. You can see that this number up over here, which says 24 frames per second, or FPS 24, once you press the HFR button you get it to, yeah, right now it's 24/24 because I reset it to be real time. To change the frame rate in HFR mode, you go up here and you get this slider, and you can set it to, like that first test, I set it to 12 frames per second. I just got rid of the menu and I pressed record. I stopped recording. The trick now to get from 5 frames per second to 2.5 frames per second is to actually skip every other frame. And there's a feature for that, which is called time-lapse. Up here, in the record menu, let's go to the right 2 steps. Oh, by the way, you can set the off-speed recording rate here also, but I prefer to do it in the other menu. It's quicker for me. So just go to 2 steps to the right from the main recording menu, and you have this one. And you can set time-lapse to on and record 1 frame every 2 frames. That's what we want. So now we are effectively recording at 2.5 frames per second. But as you see, the shutter is still at 180 degrees. To get the correct motion blur, we need to change that to 360 degrees to match with the 2.5 frames per second. So let's do that. Just press there and like that. Now we can record again. And this will record at 2.5 frames per second in a 5 frames per second file. So we need to correct that bit once we get to resolve. We will do right now. So now we're at my DaVinci workstation. I have already imported the footage. So let's try to just play it back. Yeah, this is one of those SlowRate recordings. 5 frames per second. It's not in sync at all. Yeah. So this should be 12 frames per second, I think. Things like that. This is me recording at 12 frames per second. To correct this, I'll go in here. And instead of messing about with the speed, with changing the speed on the timeline, I'm doing it directly on the clip by locating clip attributes. Here, there's a menu. I can choose 24 or custom, because this one only goes between 16 and 120, and we want 12 for this one. So we go with custom. 12. Okay. So this should be in sync. Here's a little quirk with this thing, because I did it in recording 12 frames per second, and I changed it to play back in 12 frames per second. For some reason it still has all of this this is just the last frame repeated over and over. I think it's working as designed, but let's see. So I have that one, the timeline. So this should be 8 frames per second. Select. So this is the 8 FPS. I really should be using a slate here, like a card that says 8 FPS, 12 FPS, and some things like that. I actually have one here. I should be using one of these. Right. The wonders of hindsight. So clip attributes. Do the same thing, custom. This is 8 frames per second. I import it. Here, since this is 8 frames per second, after we do the clip attribute adjustment, it's like, what is it, 1/3 is filled with content, and the rest is just repeated frames and silence. And this should be 5 frames per second, yeah. Which means there should be all the video stops there, and we all still got just a lot of repeated frames. The thing is, however, the file sizes do suggest that those extra repeated frames are not part of, does not increase the file size. It's just repeated frames. It's just a quirk also. Damn. I'm recording at 12:1 in a compression rate, and to have like gigabytes per minute is still wild to me. I'm still thinking back to back in the good old days with mini DV, where you had about a gigabyte per hour. Was it? No, I think it was 10 gigabytes per hour or something, but now it's like a gigabyte per minute or 30 seconds. But the image quality, it is really good. So did I actually put oh wait, no, I didn't actually put I got caught up in talking that right there. So let's go in here and do the same thing. So this should be at 5 frames per second. Let's check that it's in sync. Let's move over to 2.5 frames per second just to show that it's possible. And trim it down. And here's the funny one. Oh yeah. That's right. You don't actually record sound when you do time-lapse. Okay. I just need to find the time-lapse on this backup recording. Yeah. So let's see. I didn't think of that when I put together this thing. So I'm sorry about that. So clip attributes, custom, and as I've said before, you cannot actually put decimal point. What? You can put a comma? I don't think it's... Yeah. It doesn't interpret it as a decimal point. So let's go back here and set it to 5, which is still too fast. But here's the trick. Since there's no audio on that clip, as it's empty here, when we change the frame rate, we don't get the extra repeated frames because it doesn't try to accommodate for the audio. So let's go here and change clip speed and set this to 50%. Ripple timeline and change. So Now the frame rate should be correct, or as correct as it can be. So now I just need to pull the audio out of this one. Is this 5 frames per second? 2.5 frames per second? So this is 2.5 frames per second. Ah, it is. And I'll do an out point, and I should be able to just drag it in here. Give it its own track. Okay, so let's do this the old-fashioned way. I'll link that. So this is 2.5 frames per second. Okay, so I walk in and I clap. Which is at one of these frames. The clap is at one of those frames. Okay, so if I do that. So this is 2.5 frames per second. But if I do this correctly, it should be able to sync up correctly with just a little bit of trouble. Yeah, a little bit of trouble, like not actually recording sound on the camera. Yeah. Yes. Move on over to the end of this clip. Should be able to. Yeah. It's good to have sync points both at the start and the end. I totally plan for that. Yeah. So let's marry those two together. Link the clips. Now they should be. Okay. Here, right now I'm in regular 24 frames per second. Yeah, no change. Animation. That is. This is 12. And this is 12 frames per second. Animating on 2s. It's just a little bit stuttery. Animating on 2s, let's go. And this is on 3s or 8 frames per second. And now at 8 frames per second, it's still in sync. So yeah. And in 5 frames per second, it's still in sync. But in my example video, I actually set the lowest frame rate to 2.5 frames per second. And for the extreme version, we have 2.5 frames per second. 360-degree shutter. And it's still in sync. Yeah. So that's how you do it. I'll try to, let's do like that. Whoa. So that's how you do it. And you should be able to do this as well. I think that's all. So to recap, with this camera, the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera 6K 2nd generation, I think it's the same on all, a few of the other Blackmagic cameras. You go to the high frame rate mode, which is it's called high frame rate mode because that's usually what you use it for, to get higher frame rates. But you set it to slower frame rates than what your project is. With that, you can get all the way down to 5 frames per second during recording. With the example of 5 frames per second, you set it to 5 frames per second in high frame rate recording. You record it like that, like usual, and on when you import it into DaVinci Resolve, you go into clip attributes and you set it to 5 frames per second custom playback speed, and yeah, that should be it. It should be playing in sync. You just need to cut off all the extra footage, the repeated frames of the last frames. So that's for down to 5 frames per second. But you can also do 2.5 frames per second by setting it to 5 frames per second in the camera using the same method as before. You record it like usual, but you make sure you have audio recording on something else. I got lucky because this wireless lavalier mic thing, it has a backup recording, so I got my audio from it. So 5 frames per second in camera. Make sure you have external sound recording, and in the menu of the camera you go to what's it called, the time lapse, and set it to record only every other frame, and you import it and you go to clip attributes, you set it to 5 frames per second, and you put it on your timeline, and you go into the clip speed settings on the timeline and set it to 50%. Oh yeah, and also before recording, set it to 360 degrees shutter. Otherwise you don't get the 180 degree shutter after the time-lapse thing. Yeah, that's all. So that is probably one of the first tutorials I've done, on video at least, and do not expect me to do these all that often. I just wanted to explain what I did last time. Alright, see ya! Shutter. Stop recording here.